The letter was never meant to be found. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't neatly labeled, and it wasn't written as a confession or a goodbye. It was hidden quietly, tucked away among ordinary papers, as if Stephanie Pavlons hoped that someone, someday, would understand what she couldn't say out loud. When detectives finally read it, everything they thought they knew about her murder began to change. Stephanie was known as responsible, private, and cautious. She lived a life that didn't draw attention, surrounded by routines and familiar faces. To the outside world, there was nothing unusual about her days. She worked, maintained her relationships, and kept her struggles mostly to herself. No one imagined she was documenting fear in silence. When Stephanie was found dead, the initial investigation seemed straightforward. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no obvious witnesses, and no immediate suspect who stood out. Detectives treated it as a tragic but complicated case, one that would require time and patience. Friends and family were shocked, struggling to understand how something so violent could happen to someone so careful. In the early days, investigators focused on reconstructing Stephanie's final movements. Phone records, bank transactions, and security footage were reviewed. Each detail was logged, each hour accounted for as best as possible. Still, nothing pointed clearly in one direction. The case felt like it was missing a critical piece, something that existed but hadn't yet surfaced. Those closest to Stephanie described her as someone who avoided conflict. She didn't make enemies easily, and she wasn't known to live recklessly. That made the crime even harder to explain. Detectives questioned whether this was random or personal, but without evidence, theories remained just theories. As days turned into weeks, pressure mounted. The lack of progress frustrated investigators and devastated Stephanie's loved ones. It began to feel like the truth was slipping further away. But then, during a routine re-examination of Stephanie's belongings, something small but unusual was noticed. Among her personal items was a handwritten letter, partially folded, hidden in a place most people wouldn't think to look. At first glance, it didn't seem important. It wasn't dated, and it didn't directly accuse anyone. But as detectives read it more carefully, the tone became impossible to ignore. The letter wasn't emotional in the way goodbye notes usually are. It was calm, almost methodical. Stephanie wrote about feeling watched, about interactions that made her uncomfortable, and about a growing sense that something wasn't right. She didn't name anyone directly, but she left clues, descriptions of behavior, specific phrases, small details that suddenly carried enormous weight. Detectives realized this letter wasn't written in panic. It was written with intention. Stephanie seemed to understand that if something happened to her, this might be the only way she could communicate the truth. The letter didn't explain everything, but it narrowed the focus of the investigation dramatically. Investigators returned to earlier interviews, this time reading them through a new lens. Certain statements that once seemed harmless now felt calculated. A timeline that previously looked normal began to show cracks. Someone had been closer to Stephanie than they admitted. The letter mentioned repeated encounters that made her uneasy, subtle actions that didn't rise to the level of threats, but left her feeling unsafe. It described patterns rather than events, suggesting this fear had been building over time. This wasn't a sudden act of violence. It was the end of a long, quiet escalation. As detectives followed the hints left behind, one individual began to stand out. Their behavior aligned too closely with the descriptions in the letter. Their access to Stephanie, their knowledge of her routine, and their explanations during questioning suddenly felt rehearsed. When confronted with new questions, this person's story shifted. Small inconsistencies appeared. Times changed. Details were forgotten, then remembered differently. What once looked like nervousness now looked like something else entirely. The letter became the backbone of the case. It didn't solve the crime on its own, but it gave investigators direction. Every line was analyzed. Every word was treated as a message from someone who knew she was running out of options. Stephanie Pavlons hadn't just left behind evidence. She left behind her voice, and as detectives continued digging, it became clear that she had tried in her own quiet way to point them directly toward the truth. With the letter guiding the investigation, detectives began building a case that was no longer based on speculation but on patterns, behavior, and intent. They re-interviewed witnesses, rechecked alibis, and scrutinized digital records with renewed focus. What once felt like scattered pieces now started forming a disturbing picture. The individual highlighted by the letter had been present in Stephanie's life, far more than initially admitted. Communication records showed frequent contact. Some of it deleted, some recovered through forensic analysis. Messages revealed tension beneath polite language, moments where boundaries were pushed and discomfort was dismissed. Investigators also uncovered evidence that Stephanie had altered her routine shortly before her death. She took different routes, avoided certain places, and became more cautious with her time. These changes matched the fears described in the letter. She wasn't imagining danger, she was responding to it. As pressure increased, the suspect's behavior grew more erratic. Friends noticed mood swings. Co-workers reported unusual stress. When detectives requested additional questioning, the suspect attempted to distance themselves, claiming misunderstandings and coincidences, but coincidences don't repeat this consistently. Forensic evidence began to close the gap. Tracers placed the suspect in locations they had previously denied visiting. Timelines conflicted with digital data. Each contradiction weakened their credibility, and at the center of it all was Stephanie's quiet warning, written before she ever became a victim. When the arrest was finally made, it came as both a relief and a shock. Relief that the case had direction, and shock at how close the threat had been all along. Someone Stephanie knew, someone she trusted enough to remain in her life, even as fear grew. During legal proceedings, the letter was introduced as a critical piece of evidence. Prosecutors argued that it demonstrated premeditation, awareness, and a clear pattern of behavior leading up to the murder. The defense attempted to minimize its importance, calling it vague and interpretive, but the jury saw it differently. To them, the letter wasn't vague. It was careful. It was written by someone who knew she needed to be precise, without being obvious. Someone who hoped that, even if she couldn't protect herself, she could still leave a path for the truth to follow. As the trial unfolded, the public learned more about Stephanie than they ever had while she was alive. Her caution, her intelligence, and her quiet strength became clear. She wasn't passive, she was observant. And in the end, she refused to disappear without being heard. The verdict brought a sense of closure, but not peace. Stephanie's life couldn't be returned, and the pain left behind didn't fade with a sentence. But there was meaning in the outcome. Her letter had done exactly what she intended. It spoke when she no longer could. Today, the case of Stephanie Pavlons is remembered not just for its tragedy, but for the power of something so simple. A few handwritten pages changed the course of an investigation. A hidden letter exposed a lie, and a voice that was almost lost became the key to justice. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lingers quietly, waiting, and sometimes the truth survives because someone had the courage to write it down, even when no one was listening.